My name is Heather Bish Martin. I am the oldest sister of Molly Ann Bish. She was a 16-year-old lifeguard in 2000 who was abducted and murdered.
Today marks exactly 19 years since Warren teenager Molly Bish disappeared from her lifeguard
Exactly 19 years since Warren teenager Molly Bish disappeared from her lifeguard post, never to be seen alive
Molly
again.
Bish, who vanished from Massachusetts 8 years ago. Authorities are now interviewing a 60-year-old man who's in a Florida prison.
Her killer has yet to be identified, but on this anniversary, her family isn't holding any vigils or events. They're asking people to contact local senators to help change the laws on how missing children cases are handled. Our Chandler Walsh joins us now to explain.
Molly was found 3 years later in 2003 by a hunter who had been out in the woods and found scraps of a blue bathing suit. After that, one of the largest and most expensive searches in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts occurred. It was unique because it was designed by Dr. Anne Marie Myers, who is a forensic anthropologist who actually worked in the medical examiner's office previously and helped actually dig up the Whitey Bulger bones. So she had a great deal of experience, and she conducted a sort of a more anthropological search of the area where Molly was found. So we were able to recover quite a few of her bones. We were not able to identify her right away. We started the search the end of May. It wasn't until June 9th that we identified it as Molly because we found her skull and were able to identify her teeth. The area where Molly was taken was only 2.5 miles from our home, about 5 miles from the pond where she was abducted. And as a result of the abduction and how the law enforcement reacted to a 16-year-old being missing from her place of employment, from the pond, and where she was found in the woods where animals had sort of ravaged the area, we had very little evidence, very little DNA evidence. However, we have some. And because of that, we've worked really hard to be able to provide law enforcement with the tools necessary to use that DNA to be able to find this person. Mission has always been to identify how we can get people like that off the streets and how we can find particularly this person who harmed Molly. But most importantly, how can we help law enforcement in their efforts to get these guys. In Molly's case particularly, we've always said we're one piece away from getting this guy. We've had so many people come forward and share information, share stories, help us to try to figure out what happened that day and give us their, they might even turn in people that they know, that they've been close to. We've learned that over time, relationships change. People who were in relationships together aren't maybe under that fear or aren't feeling as loyal to each other. So for me, looking at this familial DNA as a tool for law enforcement it's a no-brainer. It's something that's going to help families get the resolution for their crime, and it's also going to get these bad guys off the street. If they are under the radar and they're living next to you or I or our sister or brother and their young children, we want them to be in jail. We want our kids to be safe. We want our friends and our families to be safe. We don't want anyone to be at any potential risk.
So the identification unit, and specifically forensic anthropology, seeks to identify those individuals and analyze their remains so that we can determine who they are, develop a profile, and then determine what kind of trauma was inflicted on them, which will then help us determine the cause of death as well as the manner, by whose hand. And so over a number of years, I worked at the medical examiners providing that discipline. And what's great about that is that we have used a number of different identification techniques. Once we establish that profile, we have our inventory of forensic identification techniques. So it begins with dental analysis. Most people have been to the dentist, so we can get a dental record, compare it with the deceased, or medical records, and do an identification. With the advent of DNA, with many of those cases where we didn't have medical or dental records, and we really didn't have an idea of who that person, who that unknown person might match to. We'd exhausted some of those searches. And this is something that's a nationwide effort now, we take a portion of those remains and do DNA testing, and they get uploaded into the CODIS DNA indexing system. And they're compared across the country to unidentified remains and families who have put in their DNA of their missing loved ones. And so through the use of DNA, we've been able to extend our identification of our victims, or those people that end up at the medical examiner's office, and identify them properly and return them to their families and hopefully move forward on a prosecution. You know, we need help. I mean, it's what's been referred to as the silent crisis. All of the unidentifieds around the country. When I left the medical examiners in 2009, I was very proud to say that after 25 years of working cases, that we had less than 20 unidentified individuals. And that's because we were so diligent with our other tools. Plus, we have law enforcement working as diligently saying, so if you found skeletonized remains in this town, they cast a very broad net, because we would say, okay, here's your individuals they might be, and if we rule them out, we'd say, okay, let's go another layer out to other towns, right? Who's missing from that? Because not everybody's deposited where they're murdered or where they're taken from. And that's why the state searching, having all the states participate, but the familial searching will help, because if we could find a relative, then we've got a family where we can go, who's missing? A cousin, an aunt, a grandparent? That would, again, it just casts a much broader net of familial relationship of whoever that DNA might be related to, whether it's a missing person, whether it's, again, a perpetrator. But it's certainly being highlighted with the Golden State Killer and other cases that are being solved, where these are 20, 30-year-old cases, and that person has a serial record, but they were never convicted of a felony.
Well, familial DNA testing is different insofar as what we know is the genetic markers that we look for when we do DNA testing. You know, they say if you hit on 20 of the 20 markers, you've got the person who committed that crime. You get a match to that DNA. What familial DNA does is it expands it to where we don't get a hit on all of the markers, but we get a hit on enough of the markers so where it'd show that the person would either be related to the person whose DNA sample you have in some way, shape, or form. The more markers you have, the closer the hit would be to a family member. Oh, it'd be huge, because there are a lot of cases where we have DNA, different pieces of DNA from a defendant or the assailant, but we haven't made a match. Sometimes they're in our databases, sometimes they're not. What this would do, would it allow us to expand it, to the genealogical testing type services, and you just had some great results bringing in one, just only people who can be described as evil. The Golden State Killer, case of Allison Feldman out in Scottsdale, Arizona. And it's been used in other countries to identify people who would be in some way, shape, or form related to the assailant, in some way, shape, or form related to the person who committed these crimes. And it's interesting in that 12 states right now in the United States are using it. In like any type of science, it's going to have its detractors, it's going to have its benefactors. I think from a law enforcement perspective, it's extremely valuable for a couple of different reasons. One, for example, in the Golden State Killer case, it limited it to about 100 people. But, old-fashioned police work still had to be used to track down the person, knocking on doors, asking questions, but they were pointed in the right direction. And one of the very good and beautiful things about this is it exonerates the innocent. If you've got DNA that doesn't come from that person, you're going to know. You know, and I love the fact, oftentimes we have a murder. For example, when a wife is killed, one of the first people they'll look at is the husband. But if you've got DNA at the scene and the husband can be excluded, it takes a lot off of that. We've had older murder cases here where we've looked at the husband for many years, only to be proven wrong once we got DNA testing.
A sad anniversary in Western Massachusetts today. On August 5th, 1993, 10-year-old Holly Parain was kidnapped and murdered. 22 News reporter Cy Becker found out how Holly's death still haunts strangers 23 years later.
I'm Maureen Lemieux. I'm Holly Parain's grandmother, her paternal grandmother. She was 10 years old. She was on vacation at my summer home in Sturbridge on August 5th
1993.
of 1993. She was with her father and her two brothers, who were younger than her. And they went up the street. There were some puppies that had been born, and they were out in a field with their mother. She asked her father if she could go up and see the puppies, and he said, okay, but take one of your brothers with you. So she took the younger brother. And they were gone for a while, and they came back. Zachary came back and started playing. He said, you know, his father said, where's Holly? And he said, Holly's up there waiting for the puppies to come out. So he said to the older brother, go up and get her and tell her to come back. It's time for lunch. So when the older brother went up to get her, she was gone. He came back and he said, Holly's been taken. Then my son immediately went up there and they found one shoe. And from there on, the whole case developed. You know, he called the police and there was a search. The search went on days and days, finding no traces. And finally, on the first day of hunting season in October, some hunters came across her body in the woods. And we've been looking for solutions ever since. We've been following some of the cases in other states. There are 12 states that have approved familial DNA testing. Massachusetts is not one of them. But in the case of California, they solved several murders that had happened 20 plus years ago using DNA. State of Arizona solved a young woman's murder with familial DNA.
Well, you know, you think you can protect your kids. You think Holly knew well aware. She's well aware of danger, stranger danger. She was not a naive 10-year-old. I would say she was like wise beyond her years. You can protect your children by teaching them about stranger danger. I mean, it's sad that you have to be proactive and think about these things, but I think you would rather be that way than not and then have something happen. And we weren't thinking that way back in 1993.
No.
No, but now after living through it, you know, it's important.
When they do a DNA testing, depending how much of a sample they have, every time they do testing, it destroys that part of the sample.
Yeah.
So they don't want to.
They don't rush to it because you only have a certain amount.
They only have a certain amount of samples, and
they want to make sure technology is
they
the best
told
it
us
can be.
that they are waiting until this technology is 100%.
The other technology that we're hoping will advance is duplicating it, like making a copy of it. Because if they could do that, then we could test what we have and we'd still have the copy. Right. But I guess it hasn't come that far, or the sample's not big enough, or...
Right. We have several very good suspects.
Probably a good 6, right?
And a lot of... They just can't prove it.
Right.
You know, somebody has to come forward. Somebody knows something, and we're, you know.
Are they still around in the area?
Yes.
And are they free? They're not behind bars or in jail?
No, some of them have been in jail for other charges, been in and been out. A lot of druggies, a lot of really, you know, suspicious-looking people.
Shady people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's still talk out in that area, you know, rumors and people talking, still saying that they think they know who did it.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't die down out there, really. The talk still goes around.
Since there's no legislation, so there are 2 states that have legislated against familial searching. And there are 4 states that have legislated to include familial searching, to allow it. So that leaves the majority of states having no legislation. Okay. So many proponents feel that no legislation is probably a better place to be. It's a liminal environment. And the reason for that is because if you don't have a law against it, you can do it. So the law enforcement agency that's uploading the sample and looking for a familial search would then find someone who matched that, and then investigatively, as I mentioned earlier, they would then start through an investigative process to rule suspects in and out. It puts the burden on them to then make the relationships and see who in their family tree might have perpetrated this crime, because they know somebody who's got this constellation of genetic material is potentially that person. What happens then in the courts is that it might, so let's say they find a cousin, and they find that his criminal record supports that activity. He was in the right place, he had means, motive, opportunity, and now we have an eyewitness that's putting him somewhere near the crime scene, and maybe he drove the right style car or truck, whatever. So investigatively, they're focusing down, they're ready to move forward for an indictment, and it goes, what can then happen is the defense could then offer challenges to having obtained that DNA match that eventually led to the investigative piece as sort of poison fruit, that there was an expectation of privacy, potentially. So we have the 4th Amendment that protects illegal search and seizure, and then we have the 14th Amendment that really protects your rights in terms of the behavior of the state against you. And it could be challenged. Once it's reached that indictment, or as it's moving forward, they could choose to try to suppress that and stop it from being what's used. The hope there is that there's enough other material once they've done their investigative work to link the cases that now is going to compel it to move forward regardless, right? Because you've backed it up with other independent lines of data. To preclude that is option B, the second thing, or the other, where other people lie, which is legislate for it. Therefore, you don't run into the problem. So what's happening now is that many states are choosing to put forward legislation that says, if all, and these are important caveats, if all other investigative leads have proved negative, okay, you have a DNA sample, okay, of an unknown third party. It's not the victim, okay, it's some other person. You believe that to be the perpetrator of the crime. The law would allow states to search the national database, the state database and the local databases with the intention of finding a partial match, which goes back to the familial DNA searching and partial match are essentially basically the same thing, because you're looking for a family member that has only a partial complement of the DNA. A partial match is a partial complement. So they're used interchangeably. I'm not really sure whether they exactly mean the same thing. And some people say it's just a semantic, how you use it. Many states allow partial matching, but they don't allow familial searching. Kind of the same thing. So those nuances, I'll let the courts decide what that means, because then you don't have to face what's going to happen in court and the potential of that being thrown out because of violation of certain rights. And one of the reasons why, so arrestee DNA has already gone through the Supreme Court justices ruling that that is not an unlawful search and seizure, that there isn't an expectation of privacy, and that it's not violating anybody's rights. The Supreme Justices have not ruled about partial DNA matching or familial searching. They haven't ruled whether that's a violation. Given how searing this topic is right now, and again, people police using some of these open databases, there may be a ruling that these databases get closed. It has a great deal of potential, and my opinion as a forensic scientist is that we need to bring the full measure of our science to this, and we need to protect our rights. Both of those things need to live happily together as citizens of the United States. That's an important consideration.
So there's sort of these warehouses that make agreements from these different familial DNA sites. So 23andMe may or may not make a contract with the law enforcement or with this warehouse. And it has to be a contract with law enforcement. There's regulation and rules. And what they do is they say, we have this partial match. Can we put it in and see if there's any relatives matching this DNA? And so with some of these cases, there was one in the Midwest that was from the 70s, and there was a couple that had been murdered in their home in California, and they put this match in, and they caught this guy, and he hadn't been charged with any crimes, but they were able to do it through the cousin. So if there's a familial DNA, what they'll do is they'll match it, and then they'll say, oh, okay, was this person in that general area? There was one case where there was twins, twin men, that one was in jail, and the brother was out, and he had committed these rapes. So they were able to, and again, the twin DNA is so similar, but once they went undercover and, somebody throws their Dunkin' Donuts cup out or their cigarette, the investigators will take that and they'll match it to theirs. And if it's an exact match, then they can get a warrant and further complete their investigation.
And you have to weigh the benefits, you have to weigh the risks. And hopefully, for example, I've heard the argument that, well, if the DNA testing is allowed, insurance people will stop insuring people they know have a higher propensity, for example, for blood disease or blood clots or different types of genetic markers that would point to them having a greater likelihood of dying for cancer or whatever. But I think you have to look at this. If you've got people out there, especially people who are doing sexual assaults against women, people who are committing murders, and these people are still on the streets, you've got to juggle that. And I think there is a very strong case that has to be made for getting these people off the streets, making sure they don't do it again, bringing some closure and justice to the families. These aren't the type of people we want out in society. Most of the arguments come from people who are worried about Big Brother. They're worried about government doing too much, knowing too much. Again, you've got to balance this. The Golden State rapist, I mean, there were at least 40 cases, and he just terrorized and brutalized women. Those are cases you've got to do something like this because he didn't stop. We stopped for a while, and then he, and the thing kind of went cold. He stopped when he almost got caught. But you look at all of these families that are suffering, knowing that this guy is out there, knowing that, they were a victim, someone else could be a victim. And he was very sadistic and brutal in what he did. from a law enforcement perspective, these are the type of things, as we make advances in science, they make us a better and a safer society, and I think they've got to be used.
I think some of the pushback on the familial DNA testing is as a result of the privacy concerns, but I always go back to what's for the greater good. So I understand that privacy concern and the feeling of violation, but the greater good is that this person committed a crime and they have to be held accountable for that particular crime, and we also need to know if they've committed other crimes. And we need to keep other people safe. Are they potentially at risk to continue hurting other people? Mm-hmm. And we know that, like I said, sexual offenses and violence tend to get deeper. They get more violent. They get more often. So it's dangerous. It's a real danger to our society. So if we have a tool to sort of get those dangerous people off the street, I think those young women who are going to bars in Boston don't have to be as afraid anymore, because maybe there'll be less bad guys out there looking for them. It isn't fair in our country and in our times and in our, where we are today, that women should be afraid to be alone outside when they're having fun celebrating a birthday or a success story. It just isn't fair. If you are afraid of privacy, I would say that I don't know of any cases in the country that anyone's ever been convicted wrongly by DNA. So I think that if anything, DNA has exonerated people who have been convicted wrongly. I know the Innocence Project is one of the strongest advocacy groups using DNA to exonerate people who have been convicted of crimes. So I don't think that it is as risky as it is sometimes sort of spoken about. I think when you look at, the pieces of it, you'll see that it's for the greater good, and there's much more you can learn personally from your own DNA familial testing, and the greater good of being able to have this out there for others to utilize if they need to.
Well, we definitely feel that it's up to the politicians right now. We want to get this law passed in Massachusetts and let the police have access to this DNA material. Let the police use it, let it help them solve Holly's case and Molly's case and so many other cases that could be benefit from it.
I think any risks that come with it, the benefits far outweigh them. I know anybody watching this, I'm sure if it was your child and you were told it was 99.9% effective, you really wouldn't be too worried about that 0.1%. I beg the politicians and people who make the laws to put themselves in our shoes, and what if it was your kid? Like it was my niece, my mom's granddaughter.
For most of the public, I've seen things about familial DNA testing on 60 Minutes. I've seen it discussed in law enforcement seminars. I think the public as a whole, should know about familial testing, know the positives, know the negatives. But for those people who are suffering, for those people who have lost loved ones, where we have DNA but not a DNA match, those are the things that give them the best and last hope for catching their loved one's killer. And we really have to have a debate about it. It's good government to talk about it. It's good government to go back and forth both ways. But from my perspective, when you talk to people in pain, that's the second worst part of this job, is after the homicide, after the rape, after the murder. Then dealing with the loved ones of that person. That's the hardest part of this job, is dealing with people in pain, especially when you can't give them the answers that they want. This familial DNA testing will help us do that, and it's going to make us a safer and better society. But you can ensure that by having a system of checks and balances on when it can be used, how it can be used, where it can be used, and that's important.
My parents are getting older, and they've recently retired, and I think they're starting to think like maybe they won't know who did this to Molly. And for me, I hope that they do. I hope that they can sort of put all the scary stories away in their head and just know, okay, this person did this, and we're never going to get Molly back, and it's not going to fix what happened to Molly, but it will make us not as scared anymore. We've been living, with this scary person out there. I mean, who would want to harm a 16-year-old girl and sort of leave her in the woods on the side of the road to get eaten by a bobcat or wild bears and animals? I mean, that's a monster, and that scares us every day, and we are not just scared for us, but we're scared what he's going to do to somebody else and what other family is going to have to suffer at this guy's hands. And so for us, I think we would feel better knowing when we leave this world that he's not going to harm anybody else.